Welcome to FO Talks. My name is Anton Schauble. I am an editor at Fair Observer. With me is Tucker Peck. He's a meditation teacher and clinical psychologist, co-host of the podcast Teaching Meditation, and this February published his first book, Sanity and Sainthood. Welcome, Tucker.
Hey, thanks for having me.
In our previous conversation, we were talking about Buddhism, and you were describing yourself as taking sort of a middle road between an overly metaphysically committed, dogmatic kind of traditional Buddhism and a overly vague, self-helpy kind of pop Buddhism that is quite popular in American circles these days. And I find this approach fascinating, trying to get at the ethical core of Buddhism without being overly constrained by metaphysical commitments while still remaining rooted in a dialogue with Buddhist scripture and not simply repeating ideas that you've heard from other English-speaking people. So could you tell us first how you came into contact with the Buddhist scriptures and what have been the fruits of your dialogue with them?
I came into contact with the original Buddhist scriptures when I started studying, and then more so when I started teaching. I was 29 when I started teaching, so when you look young and are young, it's harder to position yourself as a spiritual teacher. And
Sure.
the priors, I think, of people declaring that they have found some route to awakening and can tell you what it is, and I can teach you the Tucker method. Those priors, I think we could agree, are very poor. And so I wanted to make sure, particularly when I started teaching, that I was teaching something that had survived the test of time, and it didn't rely on any faith that I was a particularly good meditator or otherwise special person. That was how I actually got so familiar with the scriptures. In Buddhism, the scriptures are really, really long, and they're not edited. So the Pali Canon is the oldest surviving collection of scriptures, and it's in 3 different baskets. And one of them, the suttas, is the one people might be most familiar with. And it's like, well, the medium-length suttas go in this book, and the long ones go in this book, and this one's organized by numbers. So they're actually, there's no one for the short suttas. So they're actually kind of hard to read. It takes a while. So the average student of Buddhism probably doesn't spend a lot of time reading the scriptures. But if you can figure out, if you can get like a teacher and authors, somebody to point out what the most important ones are and help you learn how to read it, they're quite valuable.
So what do you find in that vast corpus of literature that's useful to people in the modern day, and perhaps just as important? What do you find that's not useful?
Yeah. So what's useful in there is really vast. So the Buddha, I think of as one of the great geniuses of history. So the mythology, at least, is he eventually decides to sit under the Bodhi tree and says, I'm not going to move until I either become a Buddha, become awakened, or I die trying. And of course, he succeeds. And so throughout his life, people say to him, what happened to you under that tree? And he never says anything like, I got super relaxed or something like that. He says a few different things. The most common one is he says, I figured out these 4 noble truths. And the 4 noble truths could be rendered something like, you're always trying to control things in ways that you can't. And that's really stressful, and you should stop. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we'll say, I figured out Paticca Samuppada, these links of dependent origination. That means 2 different things. One earlier rendering of that is these 12 links. It's a kind of an exegesis on the 4 noble truths. It's how controlling things causes you to see the world in terms of what you want rather than in terms of what's actually there, and how this leads to confusion and stupid action and stress and misery. And another way in slightly less ancient texts that's described is essentially what we now call general systems theory. The idea that causality is not A causes B. It's kind of everything causes everything. A causes B, but B also causes A. Your parents, of course, were the cause of you, but you've actually impacted your parents quite a lot. You're the cause of them. One quick rendering of general systems theory is you can't change one thing, that everything is too interrelated. Maybe one more thing that you see a lot in the suttas is it's referred to as the 3 marks or 3 characteristics of existence. The way that anything you're looking at is not permanent, meaning, of course, like, we'll all die and the oceans will dry up and this fake swimming pool behind me and this virtual background won't always be here. But also that everything you're looking at is a process. If you look at things under a microscope, you'd see only motion. We see stability because of a poor visual system, right? The other 2 marks are non-self. It doesn't mean that there's, you're just like me, and if only we were enlightened enough, we'd have the same personality. It means that no matter what you look at, it's not you, right? Mm-hmm. It's not the seat of consciousness. Everything you see is an object of consciousness. And that's not how it feels. It feels like, for most globalized people, you're somewhere in the middle of your head. Your knee is like, it's yours. It's down there, but it's not you. I never met anybody who feels like their soul exists in their knee. And so what non-self means here is, if you look at your head, it's the thing you're looking at. The same way that you will never see your eyes. You have nothing to see your eyes with. You can't actually see the seat of consciousness. And then the third is, nothing's going to bring you the kind of permanent satisfaction that you're often looking for. Not that there certainly some things can be, quite satisfying for quite a long time, but the way you might look at a cupcake and just think like every desire you've ever had will be satisfied when you eat that cupcake, that's a form of this stupid control that's pretty stressful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a lot of the core of this rests in the denial of a few absolutes. You deny that there's a metaphysical absolute, that's some like ultimate permanent reality that's the most important thing about the world. You're denying that there's a psychological absolute, this self that underlies all psychological processes and experiences, and that's the most important thing about psychology. And then you're denying, not that there are absolutes about ethics, but you are denying that there's some ethical absolute, some perfect good that's going to fulfill all of my happiness if only I can achieve it. And is that an accurate characterization?
I would say it depends who you ask. Since you're asking me, what I would say, so the Buddha uses this metaphor where he says, if you try to get to the opposite shore, you might build a raft and you might take it across the river. Would you then put the raft on your back and carry it around? And the monk say, no, of course not. It served its purpose. And he says, yeah, these teachings are like the raft. Mm-hmm. These teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. They are not the moon. So Theravada Buddhism, which is more or less what I teach, is the oldest surviving school of Buddhism. And we don't really use the term ultimate reality in Theravada Buddhism. In later schools, they do. And my theory is the Buddha is trying really hard to avoid founding a religion. He's trying to make sure that you don't have anything you can pray to, that you don't mistake the term nibbana for meaning heaven. And he was wildly unsuccessful at this, right? Buddhism is the 3rd largest religion in the world. And so because trying not to mention any of the things that you see as a function of practicing Dharma, so the Buddha tries not to tell you what's going to happen, right? He says, well, there's no self. Okay, well then what am I? Like basically I'm a robot, but if I'm enlightened, at least I know I'm a robot. Thanks. He avoids telling you what you're going to see other than, you have this incorrect concept of self that you usually see. That's not right. And then it stops there. Later Buddhism talks a lot more about what you see, and it starts running almost indistinguishable from theistic religions. Like, what you see instead of self could be called bodhicitta. Bodhicitta's bodhi's like great. Great's probably a good term, and chitta means mind. So you see like a greater mind. So I think the way that a Christian might talk about being filled with the Holy Spirit is probably referring to the same thing or about the same thing that later Buddhists would talk about as being filled with bodhicitta. There's like a wisdom that seems to operate your mind, mouth, and body that is not wildly smarter than you, but smarter than you, and doesn't feel like you. It feels like it's automatic and you're watching it happen. Later Buddhism would also talk about ultimate reality, the idea that you can transcend the senses and see something that's more real than what we're accustomed to seeing. In Theravada Buddhism, we generally don't talk that way.
I take the wisdom of the Buddha to be less about resolving questions and more about dissolving them. Saying, you have to get rid of these ideas because they're false, and let me tell you what the true answers to all those questions are. But more about dismissing those kinds of things is just not useful for you.
Yeah, I think the reason that Western Buddhism is so awesome is that we're all converts, right? And if our grandkids and great-grandkids are practicing Buddhism, they'll be doing it as poorly as many Asian Buddhists do, many American Christians do, and so forth. The thing where for most people religion is a series of rituals and tribalism that you incorrectly think is doing what your grandparents would have done. I think the Buddha was trying really hard and unsuccessfully to prevent that from happening.
So those are the things that we're trying to avoid. What are we trying to achieve?
I think what we're trying to achieve is sanity and sainthood, which is the title of my book, conveniently. So sanity is, I would just define as appropriate reactions to your life. Meaning, if your life is good, a sane person should feel pretty happy. And when your grandma dies, a sane person, I mean, assuming you had a nice grandma, a sane person should be sad about that, right? And at least among the people I know, sanity is pretty rare. Most of us are responding to shadows that our mind is inventing, things that happened many decades ago that we don't realize we're still responding to. So I see quite a lot of people whose lives really look awesome, like up there with the top 1% of lives that people have lived, who seem totally miserable, and people who have trouble feeling love for their children because they just have trouble feeling. So one is sanity. The reason I put sainthood as the goal is I do believe there are some bad people, people who, what they truly want is just to get whatever they can and don't believe in the rights of others. But I don't think there's a lot of them, and conveniently they congregate, right? They're at the top of everything. So they're at the top of the government,
That's
the top
true.
of corporations, and top of spiritual organizations. Most of the people in the world that I've met would like to be good people and fail many times every day because of all these things in your mind that you just can't see that are owning you and driving you. The analogy I always use for this is it's like internal dark money, The people giving a speech on the floor of the Congress It's not very impactful. There's 535 members of Congress. Nobody watches speeches in Congress. The dark money using lust and fear behind the scenes to manipulate you, they run the whole world, right? Part of what meditation does is it shows you how your mind works. I would call that the main effect of it. And so you take these dark money candidates and you put them on the floor of the Congress. And so you can now hear what they're saying, and they're, 1/535th of you now. So it's how I see meditation is leading towards sanity and sainthood. Your mind is being driven by all these forces you can't see, and you practice seeing them, and then they don't own you.
Right. So how do we achieve that? You said you wanted to avoid overemphasis on ritual, but there must be some kind of practice that goes along with it.
Yeah, sure. So the traditional Buddhist practice is the Eightfold Path. We could divide the Eightfold Path into 3 types of practices. The first twofold are intellectual, educational, basically find Buddhas or find advanced people and figure out what they believe, figure out what their aims are, and then see if you can come to believe those things, follow those aims. In Buddhism, the belief system is pretty Spartan. So the first, the Eightfold Path, is right view. And for instance, you can't be a nihilist and a Buddhist. So right view is generally defined as like, you can't believe a few different things. You have to believe that things matter. You have to believe that your actions matter for you. Meaning, like, if you go on a shooting rampage, you're going to be a different person after you do that. To believe there's no consequence to that, you can't sit with us. And the second is the belief that greediness, hatred, and a feeling of being separate from the rest of humanity in the world, that these things are bad and that you should try to counteract these. The folds 3, 4, 5, and a little bit 6 relate to ethical conduct. Ethics is pretty simple. It mostly boils down to don't harm other beings if you can avoid doing so, and don't intentionally cultivate such cloudiness of mind that you would do dumb things without realizing it. So you're not supposed to drink alcohol. You're not supposed to use drugs. In my lineage, we don't say if you drink a glass of wine, you're out. And here in the Bay Area, people often use psychedelics in combination with meditation practice. But it's more about, a glass of wine probably doesn't cause you to do all sorts of foolish things. Whereas like 4 hours of social media probably does. And then the last fold is meditation, getting concentrated enough that you can actually look at what you're doing. The Eightfold Path actually suggests these very intense practices of concentration. And then Vipassana. Vipassana is deconstruct your experience and see what it's made out of.
So first I eliminate the kind of catastrophic things, catastrophically bad philosophies or catastrophically bad actions that would just eliminate the good life from the get-go. And then I do the work of purifying myself from the smaller distractions that creep into everyone's life. And then I get to the work of meditation. Is meditation for everybody?
Small amounts of meditation are for everybody. I think to sit quietly for 5 minutes is a relaxing, mentally clarifying activity that probably everybody should do. I teach retreats where you will meditate for weeks. I mean, you sleep and have meals and take a shower, but it's basically the activities of daily living and meditation. That's not for everybody. I don't know exactly what the cutoff is, somewhere between 25 and 40 minutes where meditation switches from relaxation to exposure therapy. that when you first start meditating, pretty much everybody has the same experience. You might get lucky, and the first time you sit, it's just peace and bliss. But even if you do get that lucky, the fourth time you sit, it's going to be, what are we going to have for dinner? Here's a dumb thing I said when I was 17. I'd like to have sex with the following 4 people. Evolutionary, still like mammal stuff, planning, fantasizing. And the early phase of meditation, the first 25 minutes, is mostly just trying to ignore that and failing. And so there's not a lot of exposure therapy. The voice in your head is so loud and so dumb that you really can't get access to anything other than it. If you sit for long enough, that voice doesn't go away. It's actually pretty uncommon that it goes away. It takes, for most people, that takes like weeks of continuous meditation. But it gets quieter, it gets less interesting, and you can see what's going on below the surface. And that's like in the Matrix taking the red pill. That's intensive exposure therapy and not something everybody should do or would want to do.
So should most people be worried that they'll see something that they don't want to see if they get to that point, or what's the risk?
So the risk of there can be very serious side effects of meditation, things that destabilize your life sometimes for years, and these are very uncommon. There's been a small vocal number of authors and scientists who are saying, 50% of people who go on meditation retreats go straight to the mental hospital, or some kind of wild extreme like that. It's I'm going to estimate, among the people I've worked with, maybe 0.2% of people will have some bad side effect that they take home with them. There's probably these fall into 3 types. One is your body starts to feel not like a body. It feels like energy currents shooting through you. It becomes very hard to sleep. Another, which is by far the most common one, is exposure to psychological content you weren't ready for. So people who've had severe or recent trauma, and they had some defense mechanisms to not have to feel that, and those defense mechanisms fall apart. And then the third one is you are very deliberately pulling your perceptual system apart and putting it back together again. And so you can get these perceptual abnormalities where it's obvious to an educated person that you're perceiving your senses, you're not perceiving the world. Anybody watching this on video chat, there is no motion on your screen. Well, I'm disappearing in the virtual background, but it looks like I'm moving. I'm not moving. Your computer screen, phone screen is perfectly stationary. Your mind is combining a bunch of sense data to create a world, and those sense data don't really add up to that world. And it's possible to see that. Those sorts of things occurring in a badly destabilizing way is pretty rare. Those sorts of things occurring in a temporarily unpleasant way is bordering on ubiquitous. And so, I think for people with severe trauma, recent trauma, the kind of mental health problems where you don't have a very solid ego, you don't want to see. There's a sense I think most religious people would agree with. If I said the sentence, "You are nobody," I think most religious people would sign off on it. There's some sense in which you are, depending on how you talk about it, an emanation of God energy. You are something arising from the void. And that's a really helpful thing to see in terms of sanity and sainthood. If you don't remember that, you're Anton and you have to go to work at Fair Observer, and I'm Tucker and I have to go to work at my psych clinic, your life is going to be pretty messed up when you get home. So people were, it's quite rare. I feel like anytime you talk about side effects, 80% of people are going to be sure that they fall into this category, into which a fraction of percent of people fall. But you need to be mentally stable enough that if you lose your sense of self, you can go back to it.
Mm-hmm. Just more intentionally.
Yeah, that it's a problem if being Tucker, in however I'm defining Tucker in this moment, is the only thing I have access to, right? There's going to be all sorts of problems in how I'm defining Tucker. Transcendence means I can be more than Tucker. Tucker is an option. Problematic insanity is when I forget how to opt into Tucker at the socially appropriate times to do so, or ethically required times to do so.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we get to this point of the conversation, a thought that I'll often have is that the idea that you're more than just your everyday self, and that you need to see beyond the confines of the here and now and the minutia of everyday experience and your job is psychologically and ethically healthy, and a way to lead a more virtuous and less stressful life, is something of a common heritage of all philosophy. Different philosophers might not, put the same metaphysics behind it or the same ethical explanation, but I think of Epicurus saying, he's often slandered as being the arch hedonist, but if you look at what Epicurus actually says, you're an animal, you should live in accordance with nature, you free yourself from all these illusions of the mind and culture, and what life ends up looking like after that is a mostly moderate, reasonable kind of existence. You take Plato, who couldn't have been more the opposite of Epicurus as far as metaphysics goes, but a lot of what the philosophical life actually lived ends up looking like is putting minutia in perspective, approaching things with a saner, more calm outlook. Marcus Aurelius is all the rage today, maybe among a different political culture than the group of people who might be more interested in Buddha, but a lot of the general contours of their recommendations seem the same. So my question would be, why Buddhism and not one of these other systems or approaches?
I was a spiritual tourist for a while. I tried Judaism because that's my birth religion, and I think it's better now. At least in the 90s, I think maybe it's too close to the Holocaust, and trying to find people who are practicing Judaism as an actual religion they could explain to me required talking to people who believed women shouldn't vote. I found it very hard to. I even talked to rabbis, and they were like, "Would you like to join our Jewish youth group?" I don't feel like listening to me. I was Unitarian for a while, dabbled with Christianity. Buddhism, I spent a couple years at it, and it seemed to have everything I wanted. It had metaphysics that was sparse and non-controversial enough that it was easy to sign on, right? That if I asked the rabbi about the beginning of time, he might have told me about Adam and Eve. And if I ran into a supermarket, he wouldn't have told me about Adam and Eve. That's not who he thinks that's not how he thinks time started, right? Buddhism didn't require believing anything that seemed hard to believe to me. And it has these very clear practices for how to see what, we don't use the word prophet to describe Buddha, but how to see what the prophet saw, right? So in most of these traditions, there's maybe you could call it folk religion. it's demeaning, but I mean something negative here, where most people are following traditions that they incorrectly believe are ancient, right? And some smaller percentage are trying to like do what the prophet did and see what the prophet saw. And in Buddhism, these things aren't hidden. They're like the first teachings is here's how to start looking inside your mind and seeing what Buddha saw. And a couple years of that made me feel as though I didn't need anything else as my set of instructions. And so that was when I did the conversion process.
I see there's a set of steps there where, and you said, when you approach Judaism, you find yourself coming up against a wall where Judaism is asking you to accept things as true that to you don't just seem false, but just ridiculous. That certain, things that conflict with the outlook of modern science or with modern ethics of, like liberal egalitarianism. People throughout most of history didn't believe that men and women were equal. Not that every single person had the same, like misogynistic outlook of the 1950s kind of. You get the idea.
Yeah.
But this is not something that was taken as a given. And the same thing, it was definitely not taken for a given that the universe began, 13.5 billion years ago in a rapid expansion of space-time. So my question is, after going through this philosophical journey and questioning everything, how did you end up arriving back at the position that no, these modern liberal values, even though they're from the 21st century, I don't believe them just because I'm from the 21st century. I believe them because I want to hold on to them as solid.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of like scientific understanding of how the universe started, that doesn't have a lot of day-to-day. It doesn't have a lot of day-to-day impact for me.
Sure.
It's something in which I'm happy to trust I wouldn't say scientific narrative in that like I don't read science papers on physics, the cultural scientific narrative. There's something that the culture says is what science says. And in areas where I do read science, the culture is often real incorrect about, I remember one time telling
thing that is to science what folk religion is to what the prophet saw.
Yeah.
No, folk science.
Yeah, I remember somebody many years ago said I was into meditation, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not into that kind of stuff. I'm more science minded." What do you think the word science means? In terms of trying to treat people as equal, so if you read the New Testament, it's quite short, right? It's less than a Harry Potter book in length, a lot less. And you can find support for essentially any conceivable viewpoint, right? There's throughout history been nobody so evil that they can't say Jesus told them to do it, right? In the Buddhist text, it's really, really long. And so the contradictions are more, right? It's very clear that it was written by different people at different points throughout history, that different rulers and government have added stuff in. So it's really hard to say, well, the Buddha thought this, but not that, because generally both sides are attributed to him. So you can read sutras that say a woman should wake up before her husband, go to sleep after him, be of service to her husband. That isn't there. You also find gender egalitarianism in the suttas. You find the Buddha saying, I think to become a final Buddha, a woman has to do that in her next lifetime. But for the most part, the Buddha is saying, a woman and a man, these people can both practice the same. These people can achieve the same. There's a bunch of scenes where a devil type figure comes to tempt or try to trick different practitioners. And he goes up to a woman and says, "You're just a woman, you can't practice." And she said, "Oh, anybody who cares whether someone is male or female, they're already in your clutches. I don't think about these things." So, yeah, you see kind of like incredible, particularly for ancient India, racial equality. One of the creation myths is actually that original sin is environmental destruction and racism. There's this passage where Ananda, who's one of the Buddha's chief attendants, goes to a well to get some water, and there's some women from the untouchable caste pulling the water, and he asks them for some. And the woman says, you're a holy man, like if we touch it, you can't have it. And he says to her, "Woman, I asked you for water, not for caste." So it's not a brand new idea that people are equal. Sure. It was just a quite minority idea until recently. I think the other option besides thinking of people as being no better or worse than me is the common one of deciding that my group is better than the other groups, and that seems dumb to me. That seems anti-religious to me.
Yeah. You get there's something behind that attitude that not only seems to be contrary to charity, just contrary to the general kindness that a virtuous person should have for others, but also from a particularly Buddhist perspective, there's something that's it's a privileging of the self, right? In a way that you don't want to act like who I am is the most important thing. The accidents of my birth and perspective. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to mention before we end a comment that you made in our previous conversation about your particular time and place. You said that you think that the Silicon Valley of today has reached a point in its economic or psychological development where it's just ready for Buddhism. It's asking for something like Buddhism. Why is that the case?
Yeah, so I live near Oakland, California, and but even when I'm not here, I teach meditation retreats all over the world, and almost everywhere I go, it's all tech workers who show up. And I'm a psychologist. It's not like I have any background in tech or I'm using awesome tech metaphors that that really speak to them. I think what it is that if you have obvious external problems and you're not happy, you blame those obvious external problems, right? If you are very poor and life doesn't feel very good, you probably would try to seek more money if that's an option for you. And it might work, right? Like there, up to a point, there is some correlation between money and happiness, right? The people that I'm working with in Silicon Valley are a lot of people who are very young, very rich, and basically have the world as their oyster. If you ask them to point to external problems in the present, it can be kind of hard to do. A huge number of my students are like semi-retired 27-year-olds because in Silicon Valley there's so much wealth that you can't retire forever at 27, but you can take 10 or 15 years off from work. And so I think when there are outside problems to point to and you're not happy, you try to solve those problems. When you can't point to the outside problems, it's almost worse. The only conclusion you can come to is that you're crazy, right? You are not sane at all. You're doing something really wrong. And Buddhism is offering this metaphysically palatable system by which you can change the way that your mind works. It also now has thousands of scientific studies backing it up, which, as we were saying earlier, I think very few people read these studies to tell, are they drawing the conclusions that the media has said they're drawing and so forth. But the culture says that, science says that. Buddhism
Right.
is an effective way to be happier. And so it's just like the exact cultural pill of what do you do with a mind that's too crazy to be happy that you have some confidence is going to actually work.
Mm-hmm. So that's where you come in.
So that's where I come in.
All right. Well, thank you for a very stimulating conversation, Tucker. I'd like to leave you with the last word. Is there anything that you would like to leave our audience as they go home?
Yeah. I think that the thing I'd want to leave with is one of the most famous Buddhist suttas. It's called the Kalama Sutta. And in it, he lays out Buddhist epistemics. Where does truth knowledge come from? The lowest level is scripture, the words of the master, revealed knowledge. Revealed knowledge is superseded by reasoning. If, the scripture says that the sun sets in the east, and then you can calculate that it doesn't, you throw the scripture out. And the highest one is empirical reasoning. Empirical knowledge. If you observe the sun setting in the west and all of your calculations say that it should set in the east, you believe that it sets in the west. Direct experience, empiricism, is the highest level of knowledge. For the kinds of things I'm talking about, it doesn't take very much experimentation, meaning if you want to see what meditating does, try it for 5 minutes. If you think it's possible to shut your thoughts off and that other people can do that, you'll be very disappointed. You'll feel uniquely unqualified to meditate. If you accept that your thoughts are going to keep going, but there's all sorts of other things you can do while you have stupid thoughts other than listen to them, you may actually very quickly notice that meditation does something good for you. Similarly, you can try asking yourself the question, is there anything right now you're trying to control in a way that you can't? The answer is pretty much always going to be yes. So I'm a pretty hyper person. I'm a Buddhist teacher. People incorrectly believe that Buddhist practitioners, people who meditate a lot, move slowly, we're very calm. In fact, it tends to amplify your personality traits. So if you were manic before, you probably get a little more manic. So I look at, is there anything I'm trying to control? And it's like, don't be too hyper, and yelling at myself in my head, don't be too hyper, look calm. This is not a very good way to control having too much energy, right? And so the question you ask is there anything right now you're trying to control in a stupid way? And can you stop? And okay, can I just let myself feel energetic? And gee, that feels a lot better. That's a really big difference. And it's something you can try instantly. Look for incorrect control, see if it's possible to stop, notice how that feels. And I think I can close there.
Okay. Dr. Peck, thank you very much for speaking with us today, and I hope to speak to you again soon.
Bye!
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.